Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Heart to Heart podcast. I'm Brea.
And I'm Kim.
And today we have a really special episode. We are interviewing Hari Ziyad about his new memoir, Black Boy Out of Time. This is an incredible book, incredible episode. I'm so excited for this conversation. We're going to do a quick bio and just give you guys the rundown. They are one of 19 children in a blended family. Hari Ziyad was raised by a Hindu Hari Krishna mother and a Muslim father. Through reframing their own coming of age story, Ziyad takes readers on a powerful journey of growing up queer and Black in Cleveland, Ohio, and of navigating the equally complex path towards finding their true self in New York City. Exploring childhood, gender, race, and the trust that is built, broken, and repaired through generations, Ziyad investigates what it means to live beyond the limited narratives Black children are given and challenges the irreconcilable binaries that restrict them.
Hari Ziyad is a screenwriter, the best-selling author of Black Boy Out of Time, and editor-in-chief of Race Baiter. They received their BFA from New York University, where they concentrated in film and television and psychology. They are a 2021 Lambda Literary Fellow, and their writing has been featured in Gawker, Out, The Guardian, Huffington Post, Ebony, Mike, Pace Magazine, and Afropunk. So thank you so much, Hari, for being with us today. How are you feeling?
Thank you for having me. I'm feeling pretty good. The weather just broke here in New York,
Yes.
which I've been waiting forever to happen. The cold is not my thing. So I'm feeling good about that. And just overall had a really successful launch week and entering the second week of the book being out and seeing the responses to it has been really exciting. A little overwhelming, but mostly exciting.
That's so
How are
great to
you
hear.
all?
We're doing well too. I mean, the weather broke here too. I'm in Philly right now. I
Okay.
don't know, Kim, you're in Rhode Island, so
Yes,
is
I'm
it
in
warm there?
Providence. Yeah, it was 60 yesterday. So, of course, you had some people out in their little tank tops and flip-flops and shorts. But, it's great. The sun helps a lot.
It does help a lot. I could feel the seasonal baggage like lifting. Yeah. So I guess we're going to get into our questions now. So we have a lot of questions here. The book was amazing, really great, insightful read. And I feel like a lot of the things I, could relate to and could feel and just feel your passion, that you had
Mhm.
writing it. So we want to just kind of start with like the opening of the book. So in the opening of your book, you present the idea of carceral logics, which frame your argument about the mechanisms that work against the protection against Black people, but more specifically Black children. So how
Mhm.
do you define carceral logics, and why do you think they are particularly harmful for Black queer youth?
So I define carceral logics. Well, carcerality is related to prison, so it's the root word in like incarceration. And carceral logics are the ideas that uphold a prison culture. And for me, that centers around the idea that you can punish things into being the way that you want them to be. And punishment is how you resolve conflict. Punishment is how you alleviate tension. And it does so in this society in particular by operating along a binary system, good and bad, innocent and guilty, which are all the ideas that our prison system is rooted in. And but I don't think it's just. I mean, obviously, carcerality is really related to prisons, but it's also internalized in how we operate within our communities, how we use punishment uh, in our self-talk, in our relationships, in our families. And so I think that really shows up with queer children in particular, because there is a lot of conflict inherent in being queer. We're not operating with binary thinking around gender, um, uh, and that is often responded to in our families and our communities with trying to um, punish queer children into behaving in a certain way. And in my experience, that was to behave like a young man should, which was very gendered and very binary, and set up in conflict to what femininity and womanhood and girlhood was. And so, yeah, that's how I I use carceral logics to start there because I think as an abolitionist, it's really integral. I think ultimately to live in a world without police and prisons, but we have to start with how we've internalized carceral logics. And the first experiences of me being conscious of that was operating as a queer child in my family.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that. And, I remember the particular anecdotes in your book where you take readers to different scenes during your childhood when you're like questioning why you thought of, certain kids on your block as behaving certain ways and automatically associating them with, as you said, being like a bad child. And I found myself doing the same. So I think it's really important that in the beginning you lay that out and you just really give room for readers to think about how they have inherited those carceral logics themselves. So thank you so much for that.
Of course, and that's exactly what I was hoping the response to that would be. Like, I'm using this book to explore, obviously, my experiences, but I was hoping that it would reflect how we can all start unpacking how we've internalized carceral logic. So that's really great to hear.
That's great. So moving on to our next question. So in your author's note, you talk about a fear of sharing your story, which was brief yet really powerful. And it's something that we personally talk about on our podcast. And so we'd love to hear more about, your experience of putting your story out there and what are some fears that you had about telling your story or that you still continue to have.
Um, yeah, I think the main one is just that obviously none of our stories are just our stories. We all are connected to other people, and in particular, when you're writing a memoir about topics like this, that includes a lot of interrogating conflict within a family. You're going to touch on some sensitive areas, and so I think my biggest fear was um, to not be caring in the way that I explored these relationships, especially with my mother. My mother was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive cancer partway through writing this book, and so much of the book is an attempt. Sometimes wasn't even conscious of me trying to rectify certain parts of our relationship and heal through certain things. And so there's a lot of stuff in there that is really sensitive around our relationship, and I want it to be fair to her and to anyone else who is mentioned in the book. And so I did that in the writing process by sharing anyone who's mentioned heavily in the book. Like, I let them read beforehand, not to like okay or to say no that it couldn't be included, because ultimately I did want to be true to what I remembered in my story. But I think it just added another layer of other people's perspectives, um, and that really helped to lead to different conversations that needed to happen throughout the book. And so, to answer the second part of your question, do I still have those fears? I think because we worked so hard during the writing process of the book to address that, um, the conversations that came from that were really, really productive. And because we were so intentional, um, I made sure before the book even came out that the people who were in it, even if they weren't completely comfortable, because some of those things are just inherently uncomfortable, were at least on the same page about why it would needed to be out there and felt good about the resolutions that came from it. So yeah, that was my biggest fear. There are other fears too about like how much to devolve about, especially if we're talking about accountability and like the harms that you've enacted on people. Um, but those were things that I like just worked out in therapy and on my own. I
Mhm.
made sure, and the way I approached all of my writing is if I'm not ready and secure about what I'm saying about it, then I'm not just going to be vulnerable for vulnerability's sake. That can be a very dangerous experience. And I mean, that was the whole concept behind the representation chapter, which I saw that you have a question about later. But just putting something out there, I think it's also very important to think about um, your own safety when you're doing that. And so I was clear about that in the process, but it was a fear that came up. But another thing that I was able to work through with my editors before the book actually came out.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know to a smaller degree, we definitely, like we said, kind of have to think about that. And I think that there's some level of that for any like Black creators who have to, kind of go through that emotional labor to like put their stories out there and put their opinions and experiences out there. But yeah, I think that just seeing you go through with it and like it amounted in this amazing work, it's also kind of inspiring to see like you didn't let the fears get to you. And like I know that's something that we try to keep in mind whenever we get a weird comment or like a weird message, or we've had people say stuff about things that we talk about and it's like there's a greater good here, and I
Yeah.
think that that's what you have to like keep in mind.
Yeah, and being solid in that. Like, I think as someone who
Mm.
struggles with anxiety, those questions are always coming up. And I don't think there's anything wrong with them. That's telling me about something that I need to be sensitive to. But once you know the answer to it, you're able to move with the fear instead of pushing it away or ignoring it or succumbing to it. And so I'm very grateful for the fear that I had around this, because it allowed me to, okay, I have this fear around telling stories about other people. How do I be more
Mm.
careful with telling those stories? And then I was able to move with that to, I think, bring out a story that had more depth, because um, it did walk with care
Right.
around those stories.
Great, thank you for that. We're going to go to the third question. So, could you explain the structure of your memoir? So, what impacted your choice to separate your story into three sections, which are Black, queer, and free?
That's a great question. Mostly, to be honest, it was uh, I'd already sectioned them off just based on um, topics that I wanted to cover,
Mm.
and I chose the title of those sections once I saw how it all came together. In the beginning, I'm exploring more specifically like the larger structures of anti-blackness, and so like black made sense there.
Right.
And then in the second section, there are a lot of experiences around like relationships and the gender binary, and
Mhm.
how that is part of this system of blackness, and how anti-blackness plays a role in that. And so queerness made sense there. And then I always knew I wanted to end talking more specifically about abolition and a world where we are free. And so that just made sense within the context of that. But so the names themselves kind of came after the fact. I built it in that structure just because I think that made the most logical sense of understanding. Um, Abolition is a very complicated topic, and so
Mhm.
this book is ultimately about abolition, but I knew that I had to build up to that by explaining um, how it affects all of our conversations about blackness, how queerness plays a role in that, so that when I finally got to it, hopefully all of those things will come together and make it feel a lot more real and
Right.
present in people's everyday lives.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's so important. And you really hint at, and this gets back to our earlier point of just how carceral logics have become so embedded in how we operate and move throughout this world. So I think you laying that out through your experiences makes it feel very real. Because I think in
Mm.
so many instances when we talk about prison abolition, it seems like this far away idea that's so unimaginable.
Right, right.
So I thought that that layout was exceptional and very, very well done. And it,
Thank you, thank you.
of course, and these conversations about liberation and freedom move us into our next question. And so there's this particular quote that you state that I really love. And you said, in this colonized world, there will never be a God who appears for Black children just because they believe and suffer and are careful enough. Any God who might, oops, sorry, any God who might save them requires a new world entirely. And so, in what ways does not only this quote, but your entire memoir open up space for thinking about Black futurity and Afrofuturism?
Yeah, so I was writing that at a time where I was like reevaluating all of my experiences growing up in this particular religious household. My
Mm,
mother is Hindu, as you mentioned in the bio earlier, but she was also like a very central figure, pretty much a minister in the religion. And so everything that we did growing up was around like spirituality and God, including some really great things. And so I was trying to make sense of that because for a long time, I would say most of my early adult life, I kind of rejected all of that
mm,
because it was also tied with how she responded to my queerness. And so this was me trying to figure out like why didn't the parts that of her spirituality that I can recognize as being really powerful, the parts that allowed her to um, overcome all the things that she overcame, and the parts that allowed her to raise us with a lot, very deep love and try and protect us in so many ways, because that was so tied to her beliefs. What was the reason that it failed in this aspect of our
mm,
relationship? And that just tied to so many things and that the book covers around like the limitations of acting within this world and the
mhm,
paradigms that are established within it.
mhm,
Um, um, Again, talking about like representation and like what's possible with just making the representing us in um, new platforms and I think that that is limited in what's possible in terms of getting us free, for the same reason that ultimately we're still operating within the system.
mhm,
And so what I wanted my book to do was to not be a critique of trying to make this world better, or the things that we do towards liberation, but to recognize that ultimately all of those are limited unless we start from a new system from the ground up.
mhm,
And that is how we talk about gender, how we talk about um, uh, representation, how we talk about policing, how we talk
mhm,
about politics. Um, if we can approach all of those conversations with the understanding that unless we change things entirely, there will always be a limit to this. Um, then we can start to imagine what an entirely different world might look like. And so that's my hope for the book, is to it can feel, I think, very pessimistic and hopeless in spaces because I don't have a lot of hope for what this world is. But I think ultimately the book is very hopeful
mhm.
because I have so much faith and so much hope in something bigger and beyond this world. And so I hope that that's what people also get out of the book.
I think you definitely feel that sense of like balancing your hope and obviously you're not going to have hope for a world that was made against you. We're having hope for something bigger and better, and I think that that's something that I feel like we talk about on the podcast too, and like, are people ready for this change? And I think
Mm,
that kind of circles back to just the whole theme of like carceral logic, and like even people who don't have hope for the world we're currently in, they don't see a way out of it. And I
mhm.
think that, that's something that we definitely see in the book. And I think that it's so important that you made that essential theme because it's something that needs to be talked about. If we want to get anywhere, you have to break down your own thinking. So
Mhm.
yeah, I really
Yeah.
like that.
And I think that's distinction is very crucial. Like there are a lot, and I think at a certain point in my life, like I didn't see a way out of it, and this book works towards like, so if there's nothing we can do in this world to ultimately fix it, what can we do? And this was my attempt at trying to figure that out and seeing the things that were done. Um, because a lot of that was modeled by my mother, even though um, she didn't necessarily go all the way in different aspects. And then a lot of it was modeled in my community and modeled by my grandmother. And so I think the starting point to figuring out what's possible is to recognize the things that we've already done that are possible, that might not be um, that might not be fully fleshed out yet, but it's our
Mm,
job to flesh them out to the point where we can apply them, not just to homeschooling our kids like my mother did, and she did that for a very good reason, but also how we talk to them about gender and raise them in a world that's not antagonistic to their queerness. And so taking the best parts of that and
mm.
applying it to where we still need to work as a community, um, is I hope the book opens up that pathway.
I definitely think it does.
Mhm.
Like we have all these nuggets. It's just kind of a matter of like building them up and like fleshing them out.
Right.
Yeah.
And just very briefly, Brie and I talk a lot about accountability and just so thinking about what does it mean to hold people accountable to these standards that you're setting forth, that other people are setting forth, in terms of envisioning how we actually make an equitable world. I think is really important as well.
Hmm.
Okay, I guess we'll go to the next question we have. So, in Black Boy Out of Time, you coined the term Miss Afropedia to define the anti-Black disdain for children and childhood that Black youth experience. So, why do you think this term is currently missing in our conversations about the carceral state? And further, why is this term necessary to begin understanding the experiences of Black queer youth?
Um, Let me start by saying that there's something about the word coining that makes me uncomfortable with when I think about this, because so much of this term like has already been fleshed out by thinkers before me. And yes, there's no word that is commonly used now that brings all of those ideas
Mm,
together, and it is necessary, and I'll get to that in just a second. But I want to just acknowledge that so much of this work has already been done, and I think coining sometimes speaks to something else.
mhm,
But I think it was necessary for me because um, we don't. There's no like structured and consistent conversation around how Black children as a group are targeted dis uh, and just oppressed by the anti-Black structures that we live in. We talk a lot about it along gendered lines in particular, um, and the people who are studying like the educational system most specifically. But I think it doesn't really reach outside of the academic setting enough, and it also doesn't explore how that kind of damage goes beyond gender. And
mhm.
it's obviously very gendered. Everything is, but it is at its root, it's something that harms all Black children.
Right.
And so I knew that that was something that drove most of the conversation in the book. Like the book is about exploring and healing from my own childhood trauma. And all of those traumas were things that could be connected to the state um, in one way or another in carceral logics. And so I use this term to do that work so that I could just spin that line from the beginning of the story to the end. And my hope is that we can start talking about Black childhood in that way, because I think so much of what we're struggling with as a community is rooted in that healing work that needs to be done with childhood trauma. And so much of that trauma for not just me, but for all Black children. And like I'm talking about, I use the statistics around sexual violence, for
Mhm.
instance, in the book to point to that this is not just an individual experience. This is something
Right.
that we all do go through. And if we could do that healing work, as I argue in the book, and why I do the self epistolary chapters to my younger self, if we could work through that, I think we would get a lot closer to what abolition really is, which is a healing practice. And I think
Yes.
we could get a lot closer to the world we want to live in. And so that term just really allowed me to pull all of those ideas together, because that's the one main concept that I'm trying to explore in order to get to this healing work that could build a world without police and prisons, a world where we are free.
I think that's absolutely incredible. And also, too, in just, a lot of the academic spaces, in college, so much of the discourse around prison abolition is always thinking about by the time people are already in the system, or even
Hmm.
talking about, people between the ages of like 18 and 24 who, are being cycled and funneled into the system. And so I think, you forcing us to kind of think back and thinking about how this is so indoctrinated from a young age and how it has an impact on who we grow up to be and how we come to think of ourselves is extremely important. And I think it's definitely missing. And I think, in those conversations, people might be scared to think about what it may mean to dismantle, these systems from such a young age and implementing these logics from such a young age. But I think ultimately it has to be done.
Yeah, and I don't think it's necessarily children's responsibility to do that work
Right.
themselves,
Mhm.
but for those of us who have children in our life, like
Mhm.
how do we um, how do we make sure that they don't have to do that work from such a young age? Like how do we approach every Black child in our life knowing that these are the things that they're up against and working actively to not perpetuate those systems against them? How would that change the way that we talk to children? How would that change the way that we allow them to move throughout the world in with agency? Um,
Mhm.
and I think that that's where the work really lies is as an adult, looking at the ways that treats children around us, but also how we interact with our inner child ourselves, and doing that work now, without so that the next generation doesn't have to do this work
Mhm.
later.
Right.
Yeah. I think that's something we kind of touch on like in our last series we did, just kind of about like sexual liberation in regards to like Black girls. Just because, that's obviously like our experience and stuff like that.
Mhm.
But you see, like we definitely need a rethinking of sexual liberation in our community. And we a lot of times like we talked about this, we put the onus on victims and like the young girls who are experiencing sexual violence instead of holding the adults who are perpetuating
Mm,
these crimes like accountable. And I
mhm.
think that this kind of just went hand in hand with like what you wrote about, even though it's obviously not the same exact thing. It's just kind of another example of like misogynopedia in our community and like how we need to do better with holding people accountable.
Definitely, definitely. I think that's a perfect example.
Great. So moving on to the next question. So you also explain and you state we live in a world of unresolved Black traumas and a society where our response to trauma is punitive violence rooted in inflexible perspectives about the people who experience them. And those inflexible perspectives can never make room for our children to exist freely. So, how does the policing of responses to trauma, which is, I think, something that we're starting to get into, lead to the erasure of Black childhoods?
Yeah, I think what Bria just spoke to was a perfect example of that. Putting responsibility onto children to behave in certain ways that, in order to stay safe in a world
Mhm.
that, like, all children should be safe inherently.
Right.
And so, by thinking carcerally, we start to hold children responsible for things that they should never be responsible for, and punish them for not acting in a certain way when they're just acting like kids. And they should be allowed to just act like kids and develop like kids, and whatever they develop into should be beautiful and embraced. And so I think just by operating from that standpoint of the ways that children move naturally could be something wrong with that, which I think is so often tied to gender, so often tied to sexism and anti-queerness, that automatically is going to remove their space from just being able to be a child and just exist and grow in a normal way that would give them access to an idea of like living in this world freely. And so they start to internalize that very early. I internalized that very early to a point where there's only a very limited amount of time where I'm like, I was moving to the world just based on what felt right to me. And that's because I started to learn that whatever felt right to me could be bad, even if it was
Mm.
just who I was. Um, and so I think we have to um, be really careful about what we say around children's behavior being good and bad, for instance. Um, even if we know not to like police their gender or something, it's still very easy to be like, oh, that child's bad, or oh, this one's like not so great. And thinking about the ways that that can be internalized by children growing up is really important, I think.
Yeah, I think it's super important. And it's something like even my mom and I, we always, or she would always say to me, like, don't like think of your peers a certain way, because it obviously like the ideas that adults have, translates to children. And I mean, like, just being in the community and like going to church and things of that nature. And like, you see kids acting differently than how I might act or someone else might act. But it's like, we're so quick, especially in like church spaces to like, or faith spaces to be like, that kid's bad. And I mean,
Hmm.
like, that changing is, or sorry, that like thought process is so damaging, and that's something that I hope we change is if someone acts outside of the norm, whatever arbitrary norm we have, that child is bad. And I think that's it's like you're manifesting the child will be bad. You're,
Right.
you're speaking over that child so negatively, like you're not giving them an option to be good, whatever good means.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, it becomes this like self-fulfilling
Mhm.
prophecy in
Mhm.
that way. And it's just really damaging. And I love that you bring out that faith spaces, because I think that's where a lot of this, especially the way we've learned faith in America, which was not, for most of us, it was not passed down to us in a way that was supposed to be liberating to us. And that is automatically, I think it's going to be inherently hard for children to operate in those spaces where they can feel free. And so, if faith is something that's really important to us, and it is something that's really important to me, being really intentional about creating faith spaces that don't introduce these ideas of good and bad in this punitive carceral way is really critical.
I think we're approaching our last question. This was such a good conversation. Obviously, we can keep going, but so this is our last question that we have written down. In chapter 9, you ask whether representation is necessary because so often it is used to prove something to non-Black people. You talk inadvertently about inadvertently feeding into this cycle during college. And so I wanted to know, how have your goals evolved from then to the writing of this book?
That's a good question. I think that mostly it just evolved in that the ways that who I'm telling stories for one, is has changed. Like I'm telling all my stories for other Black people, and even I'm not. Um, it's not. I don't feel bad about saying when I'm writing for myself. Like ultimately, this
Mm.
book was for me and for my healing. And I think that even with being that intentional, it can resonate with other people. And I welcome that. I think that's great. But so much of my work prior to that was me writing to other people, which didn't allow for me to dig deeper and do any internal work. And so it's not that I think that representation in and of itself is bad. I think who you're being represented for needs to be taken into account, and why. Because if we're only ever trying to represent ourselves to other people, one, we miss all of the examples of how we're being represented in other spaces, in our families, in our communities, that could be more empowering. And we also are not interrogating ourselves and
Mm.
learning on how to understand and view ourselves in a better light, which I think is the real, or at least it's a core part of the work that needs to be done. And so if you're not uh, thinking about how you tell stories about yourself through the lens of why am I telling this story this way? How do I view myself now? And how can I change that to be a
Mhm.
better way of viewing myself? Then you're going to lose a lot of the power of storytelling. And
Mm.
so that is what I was hoping to push for in this book and through a lot of my work. I think um, the main ways we talk about representation generally leaves that part out, and it's very important to, um, I think, to the real work that we need to do in order to get free.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's so important. And I know just through my own experiences of having this podcast and thinking with Brea about what stories we're telling and why, it allows for a lot of that self-critique and thinking, well, what stories are we uplifting? How are we being intentional about what we're, choosing to talk about? And also too, it allows for, self-analysis and self-critique of, in what ways and the things that I'm calling out, I perpetuated myself, and
Hmm.
how does that make me think about other structures and other theories that we're asking our audience to grapple with. So I do think it's a really important practice.
Yeah, yeah. And if you're not doing that, you can be representing yourself, quote unquote,
Mhm.
but still perpetuating the
Right.
same things that are behind the reason that we feel so unrepresented in the first place, which is anti-blackness and all of these other systems. And so it's not just getting, a face that looks like us on a screen. It's also undoing the systems that made it so that we're never seen in the first place.
Hmm.
And we can be a part of those systems if we're not interrogating ourselves.
Yeah. And yeah, I think we're like, oppressed people who are oppressed or underrepresented, like we're some of the fiercest upholders of these systems that hurt us just because, we've internalized all these things and we've learned about all these things. And I know, through your work and through what we do on the podcast, we definitely hope like we can provide self-reflection for people in a way that's like manageable, in a way that doesn't make you feel crazy about yourself, but opens you up. Because I think people just avoid having these conversations at all
Hmm.
because people are too scared to call each other out and hold each other accountable. But I think also, and I don't know if you feel this way, but I think like accountability so often is painted as like you hate someone, so you're like telling them what they did wrong. But I think that if we start approaching it like we love you, so we're telling you what you did wrong, I think we could get a lot farther.
Exactly, exactly. I think that you just summed up the point of the book. For like, are we operating from this place where we want to heal together and not from a place where we want to punish each other?
Hmm.
Um, and what possibilities does that create to operate from that standpoint?
Oh, that's powerful. I hope everyone really sits with that last line, because it really is, I think, a large reason behind why a lot of people are just so adamant about sharing these ideas and these theories and trying to push forward change. It's really one of the greatest forms of love.
Yeah, yeah, and the any abolitionist who's a real abolitionist, like
Mm.
that's you'll see through their work too that they're operating from love, and so this idea that we just want murderers and rapists running around the community, we don't care about if people are hurt, is so not the case when you start to do any sort of digging. Most of us are survivors ourselves and are very familiar with with the violence that we're discussing. We're just operating from a place that we wanted to do better instead of keep spinning in the cycle and um, contributing to further harm because clearly what's we're doing now is not working.
Right, right.
This
Uh,
was a great conversation. I'm like so happy we did this.
yeah,
Me
I
too.
I think a lot of people just needed to be introduced to some of these ideas. And again, this is just scratching the surface of what is so much other incredible intellectual work that Hari has, written about, and Black Boy Out of Time. So please, please go buy a copy and check it out, because it's absolutely phenomenal, and it will really make you think and grapple with, your own childhood and your own experiences. And that's something that we have to do. I think it's really a pressing need to start doing this work, because so much of what we see right now is not working. And as we continue to theorize and think about change, it really starts with that inner self critique that we've been talking about. And that's Black Boy Out of Time is the perfect place to start doing that.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been such a pleasure having this conversation with you all.
Thank you
Thank
so
you for
much.
having me.
Thank you.
We will see you all next week. Go check out Black Boy Out of Time. Do you want to plug where everyone can like buy it and find it?
Yeah, you can find it online wherever you buy books. I always suggest to request it from your local bookstore. and hopefully they'll start carrying it. But usually they just order books in anyway, so you can do that. And yeah, you can, if you need like an easy link, you can find me on any of the socials, and it will be in my bio.
That's good. Do you want to plug your socials too?
Oh, it's just my first and last name on all social media. Hari HariZiyad, and I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Sounds good.
Awesome.
Thank you
Awesome.
so much. You guys know where to
Yes.
find us already, so we're not even going to plug our stuff.
Yes.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much
so
for
much.
joining us. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.